Hi. Hey, before I start, I just kind of wanted to get an idea of how how many of you have, over the last 5 or 10 years, have read about the changing demographics of religiosity, of the nuns unaffiliated. How many of you have kind of paid attention to it over the last years? About, okay, 3 or 4, 5. Okay, well, that's good. Sometimes you can just skip stuff if everybody's on the same page. Hey, I think the way I'll start is generally what you're going to, I'm not going to do a lot of data. I think data is boring, and I'm just going to bring in data with other points instead of just starting out with a whole bunch of statistics that I don't think works very well for the human brain, or at least my brain anyway. So, and I also expect, because of the nuances that I'm going to try to bring up, I'd expect some opinions from you all before, at least at the end, maybe during. So there have been. Just going to start out is the reason we have the word unaffiliated is through most of the 20th century, when Pew or the other organizations gathered this kind of information about how many people, how religious people are, I guess, or what they did is they developed this long list of all the religion, kinds of, mostly Christianity and denominations, and then at the bottom it said none of these, and they watched how many people checked the none. And for some reason, some people called it unaffiliated because they weren't affiliated with that long list. And some people said, well, that's none. It just kind of, and so those two terms are interchanged a lot. And they pretty much mean the same thing, but there is a little bit of a difference when people write about it. They choose one or the other. If you wonder, more recently, the people that have been delving into this a little bit have been using this. I don't know if you can see this in that there. Can you read those words? Well, that's okay. Can you read those 4 things? Belonging, believing, participation, and how important? Okay, that's what most of the surveys ask today, generally. Do you belong on a scale of 1 to 5? How often do you go? Stuff like that. On a scale of, is your belief? How dependent are you on your belief? How much do you participate in a church or a religious institution? And then how important is all that to you? And so that, I would say, in the last 25 years, that format of asking has become the most dominant one. And of course, it's bringing out a lot more nuances because you're getting things on a scale, and that's been helpful. There's a lot of reasons why people think, and some research shows that there's just more and more people who don't affiliate with more formalized institutional kind of religious practices. And as maybe it doesn't always mean that they're atheists or agnostics or anything like that. And I'll go into more about that later. But one of the things that's the most apparent is what David Voss, a scholar, says. He says those 4 measurements are all declining: belonging, participation, how important it is to you. But they're declining in Western democracies, and the connection between the growth of people who don't have religion as the center of their life and democratic human right values, they almost have to live in that environment in order for that to happen, it looks like, from me. Because most of this data it comes from Western democracies, and that's only about 40 or 50 countries. And so you just have to keep in mind, hugely, most of the world is very, very religious. And so you don't have to get too fired up about this stuff, except maybe in your own backyard. The other thing he wanted you to understand is most of what we've been experiencing in our country is he calls generational replacement. And I'll get to some data about that, about how the big surge of nuns is mostly in very young people, okay? And how they differ from older people who were left their religions. So he also answers the question, do young people change as they get older? And almost always no. And could it be that religion is changing and instead of declining? The answer to that is usually no. I think since most of us are geezers here, we probably understand that the height of American Christianity was the 1950s. That was the height. It's never been stronger than that. You know, our Truman and Eisenhower in those days actually promoted Christian identity. It was the Christianization of the America when we were growing up. As if you're in your late 60s and 70s, it was used as a Cold War tool. I think we all can see how that happened. Anti-communist meant meant pro-Christian, and he says it. He also says it's really remarkable that religions decline. I had never thought of this before. He said, since religion and faith both provide benefits nearly impossible to obtain elsewhere. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it just kind of blew my mind. When people leave religion, there's no place they can go to replace what they got from it. So it's kind of interesting that it does occur. There's the other part that people have noticed along these lines is the number of people in the United States, or the percentage of people in the United States that have a reluctance to think or believe that we are converging on some determined future. That was much more common in the 50s, 60s, and 70s than it is today. So just the way people think of how we move forward, so to speak, that common term that everybody uses today. Our parents and grandparents thought of the future as being more determined than the generations that are moving up today. And that may also have an influence. But generally the successful, well, in our terms, successful meaning the higher production of nuns is correlates really closely to what's called the Human Development Index. And that has to do with lifespan, education, and income per capita. So in a way, you know, as people feel more safe and secure, they cast off their gods a little faster. And Norway just happens to be at the top of that index. In those three categories, the percentage of their people that are well educated, their lifespan, and their income per capita. Nigeria is on the bottom. Also, you're going to hear about Turkey in this thing, in my presentation, and I just think that's kind of a coincidence that in today's world, because our percentage of infections of COVID are above average, let's say, and the rest of the world, doesn't want Americans to travel to their countries. There's 3 exceptions, but 2 of them is Turkey and Nigeria. So you can go to Nigeria if you want. You can still get a plane to go there if you want to leave the country today. By the way, notice that all 3 of those, the United States has declined. Okay, our educational system in our country is going down the list compared to other countries over the last 25 years. Our lifespan are declining, first time ever. And per capita income is probably gone up a lot, but of course, the top 1% of us, I think, own about $30 trillion in assets, and the bottom 15% of us actually have a negative net worth. So per capita, we're high, but you know what I'm getting at here. There's a lot more feeling of financial insecurity, and so in all 3 of those categories, the United States is declining, and I find that a little ironic that those are the 3 things that actually produce less religiosity in a society. Now, there's a lot of arguments about whether this can be reversed. You know, the religious folks in our country, especially the more passionate ones, when this data started to grow in the late 90s and early 20s, they went into, you know, they tried to come up with reasons why it could be reversed. And there's, in most places where religion declines, it does not reverse, but there are some exceptions. And I'll tell you about those in a little while. The other thing about declining religions and why they're hard to reverse is that people with no religion by far have a difficulty acquiring one. And you know that when you first hear about a religion, if it's not one you grew up in, they seem kind of strange. I think we can agree with that. And most religions are heavily weighted in custom and culture. Like, you know, I think of Jewish folks. Jewish temples are full of atheists every day. Every Friday night, most of them are atheists, but the culture and the tradition is there, and so they have a fair amount of participation, even though they're kind of nuns in a way. So it doesn't show that, but none of this shows that the West has become more rational or has a more naturalistic worldview. 50% of nuns believe in a higher something, but the trend of more nuns is going to continue. That's his analysis. One other person who wrote in the Free Inquiry magazine, his name is Barry Kosman. Nice article. Secularity is on the upswing, but it's kind of in trouble globally right now. And the weakening of religion and its loss of public support has made it more reliant on political connections. Where Trump's white nationalist populism, with its pursuit of Christianity as an ally, is similar to other regimes. I think we all know about Turkey. The guy there, of course. What's his name? I forgot his name. He, you know, he's also had the constitution changed so he can stay in office almost forever, and has created a friendlier state for Muslims. And we know about Putin in Russia, the Greek Orthodox Church. Putin wears his cross, and George Bush thinks he's a great guy. Modi of India, some places in Indonesia, the Philippines. they all have something in common. Sort of the clergy of those countries have aligned themselves with pretty authoritarian kind of folks, and that's historically really common. You know, Hitler had a deal with the Pope. The Pope had a deal also with Mussolini, and then Franco. All of our famous fascists had the clergy on their side, and they helped each other out the best they could. I ran across this quote, so knowing that it's not new, that authoritarians love religious folks, or at least they're useful for authoritarians. John Locke in 1689, he said, relations between the court, which in those days meant the government, relations between the court and the church and the clergy will always willingly succumb and pander to the court in their pursuit of privileges and power. And, you know, so now we have privately held corporations that don't have to have certain things in their health insurance. You know, we have that same John Locke kind of thing going on here. So no country that has been able to keep up the developmental index of those three things, they have not ever reversed. But those that are lower on that index and also promote a nationalist sort of populism, that's sort of a hand-in-glove fit. Major religions generally are more attractive to authoritarian behaviors. It's just, I mean, that's probably why you like a god. There's just one guy who's the boss. I'm bringing that in because we're sort of in that environment in our own country here today. But here's the real primary reason why the nuns in our country is growing. In 1986, the people who answered they have no religion was about 10%. And I'm talking about 18 to 29-year-olds. About 10% of them in 1986 were non-religious kind of folks. In 2016, 30 years later, it's 40%. That's where most of this growth is coming from. Like he said, a generational transition. The demographics that we see are an unlikely degree to change in a relatively short time. But I guess if something changes that fast, demographers are just like astounded by it. Most things don't move that rapidly. And that 40%, by the way, was 2016, and we're talking about young people here. So there's a lot more of them from 2000. Just think of how many more people there are from 2016 to 2020. So I don't have any data for 2019 for that particular age group. So what are the reasons given for the big change? There's a fellow that wrote an article about is diversity reducing religiosity, and that's a pretty accepted idea, that when people the more religious pluralism you have, the evidence suggests that there's far less social pressure to conform to religious norms when they're expanding. So as more and more religions sort of get out into the workplace and into the schools, the conforming is, the incentive to conform is reduced a lot. There's a greater variety of religious, there's a greater religious variety in social groups today, schools, businesses, and is diversity making US less religious? 3 or 4 writers I found said they thought so. Then there's the political alienation theory. And evangelical conservative political agendas since the 1980s has become a kind of a growing turnoff for younger people. This constant wanting to get rid of contraceptives, the extreme anti-abortion rhetoric, the non-recognition of human rights for people that are not exactly binary in a sexual way, LBGN, or what's that called, LGBTs. That's a real turnoff for young people. But the political alienation theory does not explain as much as one writer said. It doesn't explain as much as you would expect it, because, as usual, young people don't engage in high rates with public policy debates, and are a smaller percentage of the voting population than their share of qualified voters. So they even though the nuns have gone up a lot, such a high percentage of them are very young. When your people are young, they're less politically active. We haven't really felt the brunt of it in a political way, and that might be on its way right now. Younger people today, people 18 to 29, compared to almost every other age group, also have a considerably higher acceptance of science, which is considered helpful. Also, back when religion started to weaken a little bit, there were a lot more what you might call mixed religious households, where one spouse was a Catholic, the other one was a Protestant, or a Protestant and a Jewish. That grew in the 80s and 90s, and their offspring have the highest probability. Households with no religion have the highest, but the next highest probability of an offspring not caring about religion one way or the other is coming from mixed religious parents. Without religion is the highest one, but right after that is if you grow up in a household where dad goes to the Catholic Church and mom goes to the Lutheran Church, and you keep going back and forth. I'm saying that for Jane because that's how she grew up. It tends to weaken the certainty of everything. Is, it's hard to be certain of everything if mom and dad aren't agreeing to what's certain. I found that kind of interesting, and the reason I'm bringing up sort of the political aspect, or the not so much, I would say the participation for us as an organization. This news should say there's more people that would be supportive of making sure religious claims are not used in public policy. Where church and state separation, and that's kind of a downer for us. Young people, I heard Jim say this a year ago when he must have read about this. They're not. I'll just read from the Public Policy Research Institute from about 2 years ago. Most Americans who have left a religious tradition do not identify a particular negative experience or incident as a catalyst. Relatively few Americans who are now unaffiliated report their last experience in a church or a house of worship was negative. In fact, more than 2/3, 68% of unaffiliated Americans say their last time attending a religious service, not including a wedding or a funeral, was primarily positive. Only 1 in 5, 20% of unaffiliated Americans say their last visit to a religious congregation was mostly negative. Only a third of religious unaffiliated people do not believe in a God. It's only a third. So that includes the young ones, the young guys too. The other thing that's quite the experience of coming out of a religion for a boomer, people I'm talking to right now, is very different than people leaving a religion or not having one when they're young today. And it has a lot to do with the growing value of, but people value diversity more, people in our society. And there was less trauma. You know, a lot, when geezers get together and talk about when they finally got rid of this this thing that had a grip on them called religion, they quite often talk about it as a real kind of a merit badge, and it was a you know, it was a tough struggle. Young people don't feel that way. They don't think about it at all. They don't. More often, they don't care, and so they also don't know how to connect the dots of what more highly religious participants in our society can do to them because they're not paying attention. My take is that this, you know, that one study where they said belonging, believing, and how important is religion to you? If I had answered that, I would have said very important, which would have been the wrong answer. But religion is very important to me because it fosters authoritarianism and provides justifications, usually just naked claims, to weaken human rights and democratic values. And so religion, how important religion is to me is quite important, but not in the way I know they were asking the question. The other part is this thing about, are you spiritual but not religious? That's a thing that people are paying attention to. Even though many have left an organized religion behind, they still pray regularly and believe in a God. One author said, spirituality, when people call themselves spiritual, it provides them an opportunity to maintain what they like about usually Christianity without the bits they don't like. There's a rapid editing of Christianity, and somewhere in there, someone might be a nun, but they're, you know, it's like everything, it's probably on a bell curve somewhere. Here's some data that maybe I've already mentioned, but we'll say, I'm just going to get this. In general, the surveys agree that the US adults have gone from 10% nuns to about plus 25% now. And that's all happened in about 20 to 25 years. Again, depending on how those surveys are asked. It was in 2012 that more people started to pay attention to this. I don't mean researchers, but just Pew published a big thing that made the news a lot. It's called Nuns on the Rise, and that started a lot more conversations about this than had been going on previously. As I said, 40%. Okay, so about 25% of the country categorizes themselves as nuns. Okay, 40% of that 25% are 29 years old or younger. 72% of that 25% never devote or think about God or anything religious at all. But 7% of that 25% claim they're looking for a religious home. I thought that was a surprising statistic. So about 1 out of 11 of us are still trying to find a religion we want. But here's an astounding statistic. The Christian share of the US population from 2007 to 2014 went from 78% to 70%, and it's below that today. So in about 10 years, our country has 10% fewer Christians. The Pew said, they used some other dates, 2015 to 2019. And then it went well over, going back to 19, excuse me, I always say 2007 to present, where there's probably about 12% fewer Christians in the country than there were in 2007, which is, to me, is a very short time ago. Okay, now there's been some counter arguments about this. When the data first started coming in about fewer people going to church and all that stuff, the more conservative end of the religious spectrum said, well, the reason they thought it was happening is because the young are leaving religion because the churches and things they go to are not conservative or demanding enough. That was one of the first responses. I thought that was kind of interesting, that they thought the average 20-year-old just wanted a harsher environment and he'd go back to church again. And the reason they came up with that is because the more moderate mainline churches were the first ones to lose people out of their pews. But it didn't take very long, and Southern Baptists have lost 1 million participants in their churches just in the last 10 years. So eventually the more conservative churches started to lose. So that argument didn't work. It didn't work today, especially when you discover that 12% of American Catholics, 12% of the American population today are former American Catholics. And the demographers, or the couple that I read, thought if there hadn't been Latin American immigration, it would, the percentage would be higher than that. Latin Americans come up here and they still like their Catholic Church more than the average Caucasian American does, I guess. And so here's something I found amusing too. In 2007, the GOP party, 57% of Republicans favored officially making the U.S. a Christian nation. And the same survey, a survey in the same year, 2007, of Americans, 55% of Americans believed it already was. So I just, you can tell why people call it a Christian nation. It's quite a deal. Over half of our country thought this was a Christian nation. I don't know how they asked the question. I didn't get into that. A nation full of Christians or a nation run on Christianity are, of course, not the same thing. I'm going to skip a section here because Jeremiah Kamara, when I read his topic and I just watched the trailer of his film, but there's been a lot of writing about white evangelicals, white mainland Protestants, white Catholics, and what's been happening to them. From the data I have is from 2006 to 2016. But white evangelicals have gone from 23% of the population to 13%. White mainland Protestants have gone from 18% to 13%. And white Catholics have gone from 16 to 11%. Nuns are by far exceed any denomination today by quite a bit, if you break it down into little denominations. So I don't think I'm going to spend any time with this, but the relationship between white Christianity and the kind of stuff we're paying attention to today in a bigger way, bigotry, racism. Maybe you've all heard this, the most segregated we are is on Sunday morning. Have you ever heard that statement? No one's even shaking their head. Okay. I've heard that for years. When we divide up and go to our religious institutions, that's where again, culture and ethnic groups align with each other. That's how we bond, I guess. If you were, and from a political point of view, there's no way I can go through all this. But, how many of you are familiar with Thomas Edsall. He's a not a he's not a weekly writer for the New York Times. He writes something about once a month, and you can tell he must make hundreds of phone calls and read lots of stuff before he writes anything. So I would love for you to all write this down if you're interested in how the changing political landscape is affected by religiosity. He wrote an article in God We Divide. And I think we all know that one political party is much more religious than the other political party, but the nuances of it in this article are just amazing. And it was in the New York Times on March 25th. The guy's name is Edsall, Edsall. This is a presentation all by itself. If we could, it's an amazing thing. I just want to read one sentence out of it to show you the strength of and the weakness of religiosity in people. Okay, there's a lot of categories you have to keep in your mind here, but white secular men without a college degree, okay? White secular men without a college degree support a generic Democrat by 17 points, okay? Now these are white non-college people who are secular. 17 points is all it gains in one party. White evangelical women, evangelical college educated women support Trump by 47 points, or a generic Republican. 47 points. So the strength of the religious part, I mean, that's when you take the 17 and the 47%, there's a 64% gap in the opposite direction of what you consider education or gender would predict. That's just one little line in this article, but it's just full of nuances like that I think give us a better picture of when I'm dealing with my cousin who's going to vote for Trump because Obama was a traitor when he didn't do something to Iran. I don't quite understand, but anyway, she says Obama was a traitor. I said, you mean trying to stop Iran's nuclear program? You don't think that was helpful for Israel? And her word traitor meant he was a traitor to Israel. And then of course she's worried about embryos all over the country that are not going to become adults. So those two things are going to make her vote for Trump. But that's really the political aspects of the growth of nuns is going to hit this stuff pretty soon. Some people think anyway. I don't know. Again, young people, hard to get them to participate. All of the organizations like ours across the country in the last 20 years have really not felt an impact in higher participation in secular organizations, atheist organizations. We've kind of flatlined, even though you'd think there would be more allies out there to join our organizations. Young people are just not the joiners. They haven't had the kind of experiences, and I went into that before. Let me see. I tried to find people who were writing things that were the opposite of what other people were writing. And it's kind of hard to find, but I found an article called "Religion is Not Going Away and Why Science Will Not Destroy It" by Peter Harrison. I think he's an Australian theologian, and he claims that social scientists predicted belief in the supernatural world would drift away as modern science advanced, and he says they were wrong. But all the examples he gives are the exceptions to the rule of what everybody else uses, like places where per capita income is good, lifespans are good. All those other things, within democratic states where human rights are more protected, stuff like that. So all of his examples are like straw men. I mean, he's arguing against something that nobody's arguing against. So he was a disappointment to me. But what kept it off for me is he said in 2017, U.S. atheists were at an all-time high of 3%, and nobody has a figure that low. He didn't tell me where he got the 3% from, and it's not even in the ballpark of what people assume the percentage of U.S. atheists are. So between that 3%, which made no sense to anything else I've read, and the straw man argument, it's kind of hard to find, what do they call apologists, a religious apologist? Is that how they're termed? Okay, it's hard to find anybody that's writing from the other side. Well, maybe they're not optimistic, but it's just, I suppose you could look for it harder, but it's hard to find even people within who find this kind of information disappointing. It's hard for you to find that they disagree. Now, I was hoping you guys would get involved in this now. I don't know what time it is. Oh my goodness. I'd like to ask the question, is there going to be a downside to the growing number of nuns if what do people like us who are concerned about the separation of church and state do when the fastest growing number of nuns aren't concerned about what we're concerned about? And they don't seem to be, I think, to me, it's like impossible to maintain a citizenry that is alert to religious incursions into personal freedoms if most do not directly feel threatened. And that's kind of where this whole movement is sitting right now, with a whole bunch of people who don't feel threatened. Anybody have an opinion about that? Here's an example. Wait a minute. Oh.
Yes, I have an opinion. Sue. No, I forgot. Jerry, we were just speaking of, the nuns. All right. The young women with insecure lives will join the nun to have a home, a safe place where meals and live a more quiet life to feel safe. Mm-hmm. And then in time when they have acquire a more secure feeling, they may change.
Yeah, well, I don't know how many nuns there are anymore. That kind of a nun.
Well, you're speaking of the young ones that are coming in.
Oh, I see. Yeah. There are so many things that happen in a society that only takes about 5 or 10% of a society to really turn it. And usually they're the ones that are most enthusiastic about what they want. And right today, it's still I would say religious people are much more enthusiastic about protecting their stance of their view of the world than non-religious people are. So
is that in the United States?
Yeah, well, the belief in a deity is, that people get very dependent on it and very defensive about it, much more than, well, I don't care.
My trip to Italy shows that they are very religious, in Spain too. And the young girls grow up and desire to be a nun.
Oh, whenever there's a lot of historical things where a big change came upon us, like emancipation in 1864, 65. And then after 20 years, the protection of blacks kind of evaporated. And then we had 100 years of lynchings. Well, that was, the number of people in the country who believed you should denigrate people because of the race, I don't think declined, but just when these, like today, people are struggling to make sure they can still get birth control pills in their health insurance plans. I mean, who'd ever think these things would start and then they would just, you'd have to struggle again to get it back again. There's all, to me, there's examples like that. I wrote down here one time, a half a century after the pill and taking condoms out from behind pharmacy counters and expansion of abortion rights, it should be sobering to experience to have a Supreme Court agree that employers and corporations have the rights to special exemptions from public policy, a privilege derived from religious claims that appear to be sincere. I think the permission to use sincerity as a legal affirmation to get a desired result is the result of 2 or 3 generations of gender issue passive female citizens growing to adulthood. They just didn't care. It wasn't kept on the screen. Now, can you think of ways to help millennials connect the dots that their freedoms and security are tied in to this struggle? I think that's how organizations like ours can get a connection. They need help connecting the dots. Yes.
A couple of things. One is just the obvious observation that, Sue, I think you're using the word none differently than the way Bill has been using it, but that's neither here nor there. Back to Bill's question, I don't have an answer, but I do have an expansion of the problem, if you will. What we're facing right now is our generation has become so secure in the existence of our democracy that we don't know exactly how to defend it. And so one of the things that's going on right now is that when we witness encroachments upon our democracy, we are befuddled. We don't know actually what to make of it because we haven't had to fight to create the democracy or to defend it. And so much like the women who are indifferent to reproductive rights because they've never been oppressed by it, and much like the nuns who are indifferent to religious encroachments on their freedom, we have a broader problem of people, including ourselves, who have grown up with things that have not been challenged, and therefore we are not used to being challenged, and we don't know how to respond. I have one other comment, and that's that there's a very interesting book called One Nation Under God. One Nation Under God. This is actually an audio book, so it's okay. One Nation Under God. And this reinforces what Bill's been saying right along. It says that religiosity in this country peaked in the 1950s, but it wasn't an accident. It was a big part of the Cold War effort to make the United States a Christian nation. That's where we got under God in our Pledge of Allegiance. That's where we got in God we trust on our currency. All that was in the 1950s under Eisenhower. And that degree of religiosity was very much supported by big industry and corporations who saw themselves as having a real stake in defeating communism. So,
well, I've come up with, because we're running short on time here, I came up with a list of things that I thought younger people would be could be alerted to, and I wrote this a while ago. I don't even know when I wrote this. Anyway, it says what I say. A list of there's a list of that I would like secular organizations to take upon themselves to communicate to younger people who are the fastest growing potential allies to protect the Constitution. These are the things I think we should be able to reinforce or point out. The weak responses to climate change is reinforced by religious beliefs. It's obviously reinforced by that. Young people are concerned about that, and I don't know if they connect the dots of why things haven't happened, but one of those big dots is that God's going to take care of everything, and he made coal for us to burn, like I told everybody I heard on the radio one day. Here's one other one. Use of science to make public policy is being threatened. You can point that out to young people, since we know most of them, a higher percentage of them like science. Civil rights and human rights are ironically anathema to religions. Religions like to control your body and all kinds of stuff and the do's and don'ts of your personal life. Democratic values are also anathema to religions. They like central authorities. The rule of law, our Constitution and the Bill of Rights are threatened by religions. Their voting rights, which young people are not using very much, but as much as older people, but their voting rights are threatened by religions. Their reproductive health is threatened by religion. Equality and applying the law to everyone is threatened by religions, because religions keep asking for exemptions. Religions that claim special status and exemptions from laws of taxes and that's why they want these Taliban judges that are starting to agree with them. So those are, I don't know, 7 or 8 things that I think young people are at least thinking about, but the dot of part of the problem of what they're concerned about is being caused by the American Taliban, in a way. And so if there's some way we could communicate that, put that on a bus and a billboard, I think that would bring in more people that are concerned about protecting church and state separation. That's my idea anyway. Go ahead. I'll go mute.
Getting political candidates to run who will run on a platform even though they'll lose gives them a forum for expressing these things. Just like the marijuana ticket, maybe we need a secular ticket.
I had a couple thoughts. One was that, as you've mentioned, the religions have weakened their appeal to people, and they've lost a lot of ground on these moral issues. So the recognition of gay marriage was a defeat for Catholicism and Mormonism and other religions. So if I were a young person, I would look out there and say, this stuff just isn't as much a threat as it used to be. Ever since the 50s, it's declined in importance. So why should I be so worried about something that's weak? It's like Russia. Russia's not a serious threat. They're at the margin trying to manipulate the internet, but they're not really the military force that they were. I had a couple other unrelated thoughts. One about the explanation for the growth of nuns. One might be that people get serious about religion when they have kids. And religions have often supported having lots of kids. And people, for a variety of reasons, are postponing childbearing, and they're not having as many. So not having as many separates them from their church. Not having them till they're older also weakens their religiosity. And lastly, I was interested in knowing whether there was a parallel in politics. So we've got people who are affiliated with a party, and then we have people who are unaffiliated, the independents. And so what do you know? Pew has done a study of that. And they found since 1994 that the number of people calling themselves political independents has increased, but it's only from 33% in 1994 to 38% in 2018. So it's not nearly as dramatic as the increase in people that call themselves nuns. Nevertheless, the people that call themselves independents are the largest group of political self-identification at 38% of the populace. I was gratified to see that most of the growth seems to have been carved out of the Republicans. So that's interesting. But still, these mainline parties have stayed stronger than the mainline religions. So I thought that if you saw exactly the same phenomenon in politics, it might tell you more about what was the most important cause. But it hasn't tracked the growth in nuns as dramatically. Bill, can you unpause? Bill, hit your button.
Dr. Bill, we're not hearing you yet.
Yeah.
There you go.
In some ways, the growth of nuns seems to agree with certain American values. On the other hand, I have the general feeling that young people don't know what it means to be an American as we did in my youth. For example, we had a strong resistance to tyranny. We had a pride in the nation, even though it had its flaws, of course. America was resistant to royalism, to authoritarianism, things like that. And yet it doesn't seem to be directly related to this nun business, as far as I can see.
You know, I think that for one thing is that in the 50s, I don't know how true it was, but there was a feeling that America benefited everybody. If you were a worker, you were going to be able to buy the little house and the picket fence and so forth. There wasn't, and what happened since then is an emphasis, at least in the public discussion, on inequality and people being left behind and racism, so people permanently discriminated against. And I think there's a lot of the optimism of the 50s about the prospects of America have diminished. Also, there was the looking around from America, you saw all these disasters of countries that experienced disasters. I mean, Europe was a mess, Japan was a mess, China was a mess. They were war-torn and devastated. So you felt pretty good about being the winner in war after war. And yet, since then, we had Vietnam and, you know, the things that brought Jimmy Carter down was that endless yellow ribbons for I don't know how many days, and we seem to be incompetent at getting some Americans out of Iran. So our national pride has been bruised considerably since the post-war period.
We're fast approaching 11:30, and although we want to continue this discussion because you've awakened our interest, Bill, it's getting to be just about that time that some of us have to go with other commitments. I want to, first of all, thank Bill for all the work he's done preparing this. Yeah, maybe we can do virtual applause. And furthermore, let's not forget that next month, our speaker is Jeremiah Camara, as we keep hyping. And Charles will be deeply disappointed if we don't have a high turnout for that. So we want to make sure that if you get a chance to view the film in the meantime, that'd be great. But even if you don't, he's going to give us a very slick presentation about the things that he put into his film, and that should be kind of fun.